The topic of this presentation is acoustic environments and soundscape in London during the spring 2020 lockdown. It will be presented by a group of authors from the Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering, the Bartlett Faculty of Built Environment, University College London.
Hi, I am Francesco Aletta.
Hi, I'm Tin Obermann.
I am Huan Tong.
Hi, I'm Andrew Mitchell.
My name is Jian Kang. I will start. Before the lockdown, our acoustic group carried out a range of studies related to the sound environment in London, including questionnaire surveys in a number of open public spaces on people's perception of sound environment in terms of soundscape, not only noise annoyance. In the meantime, we also made sound recordings of those places. On the other hand, we also examined noise complaints government received from general public, especially the factors influencing the complaints. So triggered by the lockdown in 2020, we did 3 studies, and the scope was to examine changes of the acoustic environment and its perception by lockdown. Firstly, we compared the 2019 and 2020 sound recordings in open public spaces to use this golden opportunity to see how sound field and sound types changed if human activities were dramatically reduced. Secondly, using our 2019 and 2020 data, we developed a model to predict how people perceive sound environment in lockdown situations, which is often the situation acoustic designers dreamed to achieve. Thirdly, we compared 2019 and 2020 noise complaints and see how happy or unhappy acoustically people would become when our lifestyle is dramatically changed.
The lockdown measures implemented in the UK to contain the first wave of the COVID-19 outbreak were not particularly strict if compared with other countries. This came into force on the 26th of March 2020 and overall required for people to stay home and only leave their place of residence for limited purposes like shopping for groceries, some form of exercise, going to work if working from home was not possible, etc. So taking advantage of binaural recordings that we had carried out in 2019 and different sites in London, we selected 11 locations representing a cross-section of urban public spaces with varying compositions of sound sources and repeated the same measurement protocol during the lockdown in spring 2020. We compared the database of 620 recordings in 2019 and 481 in 2020. We calculated LAEQ, LAE10, LAE90, loudness and sharpness for each of those. The general aims were investigating the potential of the containment measures to affect the urban acoustic environment at local level rather than city scale, and consequently investigating whether the implementation of a nationwide policy of lockdown would result in different changes depending on context. Reductions in sound levels ranged from 10.7 decibels to 1.2 decibels, depending on location. Afterwards, we ran a cluster analysis on the acoustic features of the 2019 recordings for the 11 locations, and these grouped them into 3 types of urban settings: quiet areas, active areas, and traffic-dominated areas. When considering the mean sound levels reductions between 2019 and 2020 as function of area type, we see the biggest reductions for active areas, on average 6.6 decibels, followed by traffic-dominated areas, on average 4.5 decibels, and lastly, quiet areas, on average 3.6 decibels. Possible explanation for that is that road traffic at the selected locations in London is still sustained to some extent, while the most significant variation in active areas is due to the lack of non-motorized human activity on site. The locations in the cluster labeled as quiet areas were already not particularly noisy even before the lockdown, so the small changes observed are probably again due to the absence of people.
This meant that we could now look potentially into the effect human activities have on soundscape perception. Here you can see the 11 sites we surveyed across London. The color code here corresponds to the one in the previous slide, so you can understand which areas came out as quiet, red, active, green, or traffic-dominated, blue ones. For the predictive modeling study, we also included a dataset from Venice, 2 sites only, a typical historical urban square, a square of all squares if you want, and a park. Venice is, of course, a unique city, being in a lagoon floating on water, having no cars at all, while London could be considered more of a typical multi-million city. However, the paved square versus park dichotomy exists in both, and as you will see in the next slides, the effect of human activities disappearing was actually the most dramatic in Piazza San Marco, which plummeted from vibrant to calm. As John mentioned earlier, all the sites were surveyed in 2019 for both acoustic measures and subjective responses following the SSID protocol and the ISO 12913 Part 2 Method A. That's how we got data on sound source dominance and perceptual attributes together with the binaural measurements and recordings Francesco just described. This enabled us to understand individuals' exposure and perceptual outcome and build a series of linear multi-level models predicting the three sound source types, dominance, and the soundscape pleasantness and eventfulness per the Part 3 of the soundscape ISO, meaning the coordinates are derived from the 8 perceptual attributes of the method A. This again enabled us to run the 5 multi-level models on the binaural recordings collected in 2020 and ultimately understand how these soundscapes would be perceived if there were people there to experience them. Not all locations behaved in the same way. We looked into the vector of detected change for 2D pleasant versus eventful space and grouped the locations into groups based on the magnitude and the direction of change. The subsequent validation experiment we conducted online using Gorilla Experiment Builder and a subset of binaural recordings confirmed the trends. And here you can see a very consistent reduction in human sound sources. This is for all the 13 locations together.
In this study, we investigated variance in noise complaints reported by residents to local authorities across Greater London. Noise complaints is a behavior depending on individual attitude, noise perceptions, and noise levels. As we know, noise level decreased significantly during the lockdown. However, when we examined the noise complaints, we found the number of noise complaints increased by the 48% during the lockdown, compared with the same period during 2019. And the complaints about construction and neighborhood reported significant increase with the value of 36% and 50% respectively. So from the map, we can see the change rate of noise complaints was distributed unevenly across London. So we tried to figure out how urban factors may influence them. From the right table, we found the change rate of noise complaints is related to housing and demographic factors, but not related to transport factors and traffic noise. So maybe we can see in this special situation, such a nationwide lockdown, urban factors are more significant for noise complaint increase than the actual noise. This study provides a novel view to investigate the sound environment. Furthermore, as one of the lockdown measures, working from home, it is likely this will become an increasingly common practice in the future. So noise complaints will be a more crucial factor in the context of public health and human well-being.
Each of these three studies demonstrate different approaches for understanding how the sound environment of London and its impacts changed during the 2020 lockdown. In the first, the objective data collected from over 1,000 recordings allowed us to characterize the physical environment itself. This showed that reductions in sound level varied depending on the type of space, but generally represented a notable decrease in sound level. The second study then demonstrated, 1, the importance of considering the subjective perception of these spaces, and 2, presents a novel predictive model of soundscape. Our model allows us to take that objective data and use it to investigate how the sound source composition of the spaces and the likely soundscape assessment changed during the lockdown, in a situation where in-person surveys was impossible. Finally, by using the noise complaints dataset from London boroughs, we clearly demonstrate that the reduction in physical sound levels due to the lockdown seen in Study 1 and in countless other studies does not result in reduced noise complaints from residents. Taken together, the results from these studies demonstrated that reduced urban activity leads to uneven sound level reduction across urban spaces, and that significant sound level reductions do not universally result in improvements to the soundscape, whether in public spaces or at home. Thank you very much for joining us.